Okay. We're going to read some more from Canada and the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. We're continuing on where we left off, Conquering the West. In 1873, after the conquest of Red River and as the numbered treaties were being signed, Canada created the Northwest Mounted Police, NWMP, predecessor of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to establish Canada's presence west of Winnipeg. In 1996, David Cruz and Alison Griffiths published a popular history of that first expedition of the NWMP, a book hailed by much of the Canadian press, including the Toronto Star, which called it charmingly un-PC. In the preface to The Great Adventure, How the Mounties Conquered the West, 1996, the authors described the adventure, quote, "It was a swashbuckling, glorious, near-tragic, humorous, and often poignant adventure. With little training and less experience, the police signed up to march into the wild frontier and pacify the Indians, stop the whiskey trade, police the Canadian border, and bring law to a lawless land." This is a remarkable way to introduce modern audiences to the prelude to genocide. This great adventure, quote unquote, was the first attempt by Canada to assert its claim to the West and to lay the foundations for a process that would lead to near destruction of several Indigenous nations. It was instrumental in building the relationships and training necessary for Canada to crush the final significant Indigenous uprising of that era in 1855. Comrade Internet, welcome to the show. How was Toronto? I hope you had a good trip. Oh, fair enough, fair enough. I will be putting it up after. Warm, yeah. Things were good. I'm glad to hear that. And it established patterns in the relationship between colonial police and the Indigenous peoples that remain disturbingly present today. As such, the story Cruz and Griffiths tell is, in fact, significant. The glee with which they tell it illustrates something about the Canada of the 1990s. Oh, Canada likes to frame a lot of its history in quaintness and cheerfulness. Much of the story is told through the voices of this first contingent of Canadian police, giving us a clear window into the average settler understanding of Indigenous peoples in the 1870s. Jean Detrigue, a Montreal schoolteacher before joining the police, reported that a friend told him, "The Indians will scalp you as soon as they look at you. Civilized hair is like an aphrodisiac to these poor brutes. They can't help themselves." D'Artrigue was taken by the idea of joining the force that would conquer them, writing, "I fancied I saw myself," or quote, "I fancied I saw myself fighting the Indians and the whiskey traders. I saw settlements destroyed by the red men, the ladies carried away to worse than slavery, husbands and fathers calling upon us to rescue their wives and daughters." Right from the start, then, these conquerors were tapping into the colonial imagination. The white man would ride into savage lands and rescue pure white women from the barbarous natives. D'Artrigue was not alone in this fantasy. Fred Bagley expected to be potting hostile savages and hobnobbing with haughty Indian princes and lovely unsophisticated princesses. Even within this small company, the wide range of colonial fantasies was present. Yeah, many of them imbued with the patriarchal colonial desire to take native brides, which must be understood to imply not just notions of romance, but also of sexual violence, which was always an assumed part of the inherited rights of the colonizing man. One unnamed trainee understood his trek as an escape from civilization, and he planned to, quote, marry an Indian woman and settle down in a region entirely savage. End quote. Notably, the Canadian authors of this narrative, writing in 1996, do not themselves shy away from the language and ideology so common among the settler police of the 1870s. Though Cruz and Griffiths praise some individual Indigenous and mixed-race characters in their narrative, notably Jerry Potts, an Indigenous collaborator who worked closely with the police, they nevertheless describe the Great Plains as being where the hand of civilization poked tenuous fingers into the last Indian stronghold on the frontier. The idea that Canadian police were bringing, quote, civilization to the West is never questioned in the tale they tell. Indeed, Cruz and Griffiths uncritically cite a U.S. Army officer calling Indigenous society, quote, a life of savagery, unquote, where, quote, there is no right and wrong, unquote. The Diaries of Canadian Settlers Vanguard establish several important facts about the conquest of the West. First, the Indigenous peoples were considered a hostile foreign power. Joseph Carskadden's diary describes his party of 300 men in a foe's country. John McIlree suggests that the Blackfoot did not fancy our coming into their country, and Fred Bagley notes that the police force explicitly considered the Cypress Hills to be enemy territory. If the force Canada sent to pacify the West was considered themselves to be dealing with a foreign enemy, it seems entirely reasonable that we, in the 21st century, call this a formative case of foreign policy. Indeed, historian J.R. Miller emphasizes that Canada made a conscious effort to reframe these international relations as domestic affairs as its goals shifted towards outright conquest. Second, it is abundantly clear that the Canadian force was negotiating in bad faith with the Indigenous nations it encountered. The leader of the expedition, Colonel French, is quoted in a powwow with Sioux leaders saying, "We do not want the land of the Dakota nor anyone else's." Curious how it's always the civilized that negotiate in bad faith and not the brutes. Yeah, interesting, eh? Very interesting indeed. This was patently false. As the authors happily conclude, within a few years, the Northwest Mounted Police had become a full-fledged presence in the Young Dominion. The Blackfoot Territory had been signed, the Blackfoot Treaty had been signed, Sioux Chief Sitting Bull had been routed from his Canadian sanctuary, Indians from the Great Lakes to the Rockies had been shepherded onto reservations, the buffalo were just a memory, Louis Riel was dead, and the last spike in the Canadian Pacific Railway had been driven home. Finally, their words illustrate the deeply ingrained colonial mentality that possessed these conquerors. The Indigenous people they meet are barbarous, dirty and ugly, lazy, grotesque, effeminate, a nasty begging lot who crawled like snakes, were skilled at evasion, and who were, when compared to the tales of writers like James Fenimore Cooper, a low-browed, dull-eyed, and brutish disappointment. What is perhaps most striking is the casual and colonial sexualization of Indigenous women. This is a point I return to in the following chapter, but it is worth noting, alongside remarks in police diaries about Indigenous women's grotesque coquetry, and the fact that police and Indian agents regularly engaged in sexual violence and even established bride pricing systems, wherein they would withhold rations in order to secure their access to teenaged Indigenous women. The practice was defended in Canada's Parliament as reasonable free market exchange. A telling footnote here is the fact that these colonial troops actively compared Indigenous people to the Irish, one declaring to the raucous laughter of his mates that the Sioux sound exactly like the Irish, and following it up with a mockery of the two accents mashed up. Ireland, of course, was one of Britain's earliest colonial projects, and the Irish were engaged in a very serious struggle against British colonialism, which was spilling over into Canada, where Irish Fenian rebels plotted attacks against British North American colonies and were subject to mass arrests and even a public hanging of one alleged Fenian. That these Canadian police would make that connection speaks to the way that colonial ideology pervaded their mindset. Indeed, many of the individuals involved in this expedition would go on to play key roles in Canada's early foreign adventures. Many remained connected to the police and helped win the War of 1885, while others went on to apply the skills they learned in the West to help the Empire crush revolts in Australia, India, and South Africa. The Indian Act. There's no document more foundational to Canadian foreign policy than the Indian Act of 1876, the first full, codified framework through which Canada dealt with its formative foreign relations. While the roots of Canadian policy must be traced through the histories of French and English colonial policies, the Indian Act is a truly Canadian product, a profound statement of what Canada was and what it would be. The Indian Act consolidated and bolstered laws, agreements, and a general policy thrust that had already been put in place by the newly confederated Dominion and borrowed heavily from a law passed prior to Confederation, the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857. Indeed, nothing about the conquest of the West and the decimation of the indigenous nations in this period was particularly new. Rather, it followed patterns and practices already developed during the French and British colonial era. Consider what the Mi'kmaq leaders said in 1848 as their people starved on reserves in Nova Scotia. Some of your people say we are lazy, still we work. If you say we must go hunt, if you say we must go and hunt, we tell you again that to hunt is one thing, but to find meat is another. They say to catch fish, and we try. They say make baskets, but we cannot sell them. They say make farms, this is very good, but will you help us till we cut away the trees and raise the crop? We cannot work without food. The problems identified by the Mi'kmaq, dispossession of land, disruption of hunting and fishing, collapsed markets for indigenous goods, and inadequate support in the transition to agriculture, were all mirrored in the crises imposed on indigenous peoples in the West. When the policymakers decided to populate the West with European settlers loyal to the Crown and the new Dominion, the project presupposed the dislocation and destruction of the indigenous people who lived there. The Indian Act was thus passed with a careful eye to the dispossession of indigenous territory and an acute awareness that indigenous and Métis resistance to their disposition was likely and could be significant. As such, the Act's primary goals were to facilitate the seizure of territory while undermining the prospects for resistance. In the service of that project, and inflated with the assumption of civilizational and racial superiority, the Indian Act presumed to dictate nearly every aspect of indigenous life, from its political structures and limitations, to the physical movement of indigenous people, to the very terms by which indigeneity would be defined. The extreme degree to which Canada would control the lives of Indigenous people under the Indian Act made it comparable to the later apartheid systems in South Africa and Israel. And there is evidence to suggest that Adolf Hitler reflected with admiration on the Canadian system for Indigenous segregation and subjugation. Contemplating the possible international responses to a wholesale extermination of European Jews, Hitler noted in 1941, We also eat wheat from Canada and do not think of the Indians. In other words, an effective campaign of genocide would erase not just people, but the very memory of them. Yeah, this is a good one. This is a good book. I am liking it so far. Entire books have been dedicated to parsing out the terms of the Indian Act, which was subject to many adaptations in the ensuing years. But its fundamental purpose was to ensure that Indigenous peoples either assimilate or disappear. Whether the Canadian government truly intended for Indigenous people to adapt themselves to settler society is an open question. For instance, while Canada insisted to Indigenous communities that they adopt agricultural production, it routinely failed to provide the seeds, tools, and other technical assistance it promised in the treaties it signed. In fact, one of the most successful 19th century Indigenous transitions to agriculture was that of the Sisseton Dakota, who actually refused to make treaty with Canada. Did Canada want Indigenous people to turn the reserves into successful agricultural colonies, or did it want them to die out and make space for European settlement? The answer probably varied from one colonial official to the next. In practice, Canadian policy tended to have the latter effect, leading either to the outright starvation of Indigenous people or the less dramatic but equally profound destruction of Indigenous culture. We must be careful with this word, culture. A careless observer might think of culture as simply its outward reflections: clothing, art, recipes, dance, and music. These are obviously important aspects of any people's cultural identity, but it is easy for a contemporary Canadian to downplay the notion of cultural genocide if one thinks only of these things. It can also lead to the oversimplistic notion that this damage can be undone if contemporary Indigenous peoples are given the space and resources to rediscover and reconnect with their traditional clothing and art forms. But while these are certainly positive steps, they reflect a misunderstanding of what culture means. A nation's culture is what it produces, things like language and art. Culture exists not just in the artistic expressions of a people, but in the political economy, ecology, and epistemology to which music, clothing, and art give expression. Culture is a social understanding of our place in the universe, our relations with one another, our relations with nature and animal life, how we constitute families, how we relate to our bodies and our sexuality, how we work, how we communicate, how we conceive of justice, how we make decisions, how we divide health, what makes us happy or sad, and so much more. The cultural genocide of Indigenous nations was the breaking of those structures, those systems of knowledge, understanding, and meaning, which had developed and changed over centuries, and which formed the basis for the music, art, and dances that contemporary Canada promotes as gestures towards its own tolerance and inclusion. A similar point is powerfully argued by Glenn Sean Coulthard in his analysis of the anti-colonial struggles of the Dene in the 1970s and 1980s. Coulthard argues that culture should be understood as the interconnected social totality, encompassing the economic, political, spiritual, and social, drawing from the broadest definition of Marx's category of mode of production. Many social scientists think of mode of production purely as an economic category, capturing the processes by which things are produced. Coulthard insists that this term encompasses both the productive forces, technology, resources, labor, and the way these are organized, and also the forms of thought, behavior, and social relationships that both condition and are conditioned by these productive forces. This broader definition of culture is what Canada sought to destroy, and many of the concrete processes it used flowed through the Indian Act, which, although it was passed and amended in parallel to the signing of treaties, often contradicted the letter and spirit of them. For instance, the Indian Act completely reoriented Indigenous political structures to revolve around the Canadian government. In fact, it claimed the complete political authority of Canada over Indigenous peoples, a remarkable statement given that Canada was still engaged in the process of signing nation-to-nation treaties. Ultimately, the Indian Act would create from scratch a political structure known as the Band Council, through which Indigenous peoples could govern themselves. However, the system had no roots in actual Indigenous governance structures, was created to be institutionally dominated by the Department of Indian Affairs, DIA, which had a veto power over any decision made through the Band Council system. In addition to controlling Indigenous governments, or Indigenous governance, the Indian Act would soon be amended to create a pass system where the DIA would track and restrict Indigenous peoples' movement in and out of reserves. Passes to leave the reserve had to be justified to an Indian agent who had full authority to ask whatever questions and place whatever restrictions they wanted. Even hardened colonial officials like Edgar Dewdney insisted that this would require a renegotiation of treaties, since it violated them so wildly. Meanwhile, the officials who managed this system, the Northwest Mounted Police and the Department of Indian Affairs, exhibited the full range of colonial abuses of power, from refusing certain individuals' movement to petty grievances, to sexual harassment and violence in exchange for granting of passes. Even the very definition of indigeneity was to be determined by Canada. Holding official Indian status came to be a point of difficulty and contention for Indigenous people. As a status Indian, one could not vote or participate in Canadian civic life, thus being relegated to participation only in the ineffectual Band Council system. Indigenous people could renounce their Indian status, but once this was done, it could never be regained, thus extinguishing forever a person's connection to their Indigenous heritage under Canadian law. What is more, the Canadian government itself got to decide who began as a status Indian based on labyrinthine measurements of quantities of Indigenous lineage, and it further determined that Indian status would flow exclusively through male bloodlines. An Indigenous woman who married a non-Indigenous man thereby lost her Indian status. As Barrington Walker points out, the Indian Act did not exclusively define indigeneity on the basis of blood. At 21 years old, status Indians could apply for voluntary enfranchisement in Canadian civic life, where a DIA agent would assess the degree of civilization to which the Indigenous person had attained, and the character for integrity, morality, and sobriety which he or she bears. Meanwhile, the reserve system, set up under the auspices of the supremely powerful DIA, divided Indigenous nations into small bands, scattered them across the country at great distances from one another and often far away from the territory they knew. This was a conscious strategy of conquest and was in direct violation of the treaties Canada had signed, which clearly allowed Indigenous nations to choose their own reserve territories. In fact, when Cree leaders Mistahamasqua, Minnehakosis, and Pipot demanded contiguous reserves in order to carve out a small united Indigenous region, Canada's official representative refused. Edgar Dewdney instead threatened to withhold food aid and arrest leaders who continued pursuing the plan. Keeping the reserves separated was a simple divide and conquer strategy, which dovetailed with similar tactics described by Howard Adams. Consistent with colonialization principles, colonization principles, Indian affairs agents made a practice of sowing dissension by exaggerating band and tribal differences so that Native people were led to believe that neighboring Indians and Métis were mean, cruel, and unfriendly. This systematic colonization makes colonized people suspicious of their neighbors, while the colonizers appear peaceful and civilized. The colonizer encourages the different colonial groups to distrust each other and thus keeps them divided and isolated, weaker and easier to control. These were only a few of the colonial measures embedded in the Indian Act, some of which I take up further in the next chapter. It was nothing less than the blueprint for genocide, a roadmap for the complete destruction of the indigenous peoples, whose resistance to colonialism had made them ineffective slaves and unwilling subjects, and who, therefore, had to be cleared out of the way of Canadian settler capitalism. Even as the terms of the Indian Act were being drawn up, Canada established a colonial police force to administer them, and used violence and starvation to kettle Indigenous peoples into reserves, where the new laws could be enforced. By the 1880s, there were only a few hundred Indigenous people in the West who remained outside of reserves, while some 20,000 were now locked into what Howard Adams called the prison of grass.